Jim had hoped it was the long, tall salesman whom he had seen dodging about upstairs and outside the kitchen door. Now he knew better. It was a futile hope, and here was the proof. He could still hear Bo Mitchell's voice. "I don't like double-crossers." Jim could see him standing in that cul-de-sac in San Antonio with his hands outstretched. He recalled the amazement on Mitchell's face. And he could remember too well the pleasant tone when Mitchell talked to Jerry Dupree on the telephone from his office. Jim could have dealt with Dupree on his home grounds with no trouble at all. But there was more to it. Bo Mitchell had stumbled quite recently into something that really held his attention. Jim guessed the answer was concerned with the Grand Manor. He sensed Bo Mitchell was in the hotel, but he couldn't quite see LaDon and George as his henchmen. If he had kept Jerry Dupree in Fort Worth, he would never have known the difference. But not only was Dupree in a mess of trouble, so was Jim. The whole bit spelled money, but he didn't have a single answer. Maybe if anyone could bless a hurricane, he guessed he could, at least for a moment. Bertha gave him time to find some answers. Mrs. Benning had owned the hotel for years. The question kept repeating in his mind. Why now? Why now? What drew Jerry Dupree here now? And why had Mrs. Benning been removed right at this particular time? Here's where Reese came into the picture, the quiet little man in the seersucker suit. Reese had blurted out something about correspondence with Mrs. Benning. He had come to see her and was quite upset by her death. At least was available for questioning. And Jim had one trump card, Mrs. Benning's heir. The short salesman was still poking at his recumbent friend. George was smiling slyly at Jim over the bar. He ignored him, took a couple of glasses and a bottle from the shelf behind him, and started for the lobby without protest from either of them. In the lobby, things had changed. There was not one more window to tape. This left a bunch of frightened people huddled around, speechless, in wobbly rattan chairs. They were in little groups, as if they didn't know the rest were there. Aunt Annie and Lena were seated close together. In another corner, the bride and groom were seated closer together. The Tribbles had retired to the dining room, where she had put her head down on her arm on a table. Reese sat alone staring at the east wall, as if it would collapse at any moment. LaDon leaned on the desk, but he was still definitely gone. They all looked like they were waiting for doomsday. Maybe this was it. How would they know? Jim looked for Mrs. Wharton and found her sitting on the second step of the stairs. She was smoking a cigarette, leaning against the wall, and staring at the ceiling. Of all of them, she was quite composed. He walked across the lobby and put the bottle and the glasses beside her. "I'll be back shortly," he said. "I want to have a word with Reese." Jim nodded in his direction. She shrugged, and he picked up a chair and descended on the man in the seersucker suit. Reese seemed quite aloof. This might be hard sledding, but Jim had to have a go at it. "Mr. Reese, you said you had correspondence with Mrs. Benning?" Reese gave a long, cool stare from under colorless brows and lashes. Finally, he nodded. This was going to be rough, just as Jim predicted, unless he got Jerry Dupree into the act right now. "You were looking for Mrs. Benning's heir?" Jim asked. Reese nodded again, but his mouth tightened. Jim came up with a small lie. "I represent Mrs. Benning's nephew." "Is your business with him of great importance?" Dryly he replied, "Yes, my business is of great importance." "Do you know where Mrs. Benning's nephew is, sir?" Before Jim could answer, he asked another question and made a comment Jim had not expected. "By what authority do you represent her heir? You do have a name?" He looked Jim straight in the eye and added, "I am a numismatist. My name is Jim Smith, and I am connected with a firm of private investigators in Chicago. I have been hired to take charge of Mr. Dupree, Mrs. Benning's nephew." This was no lie, but it did indicate incompetence where Jerry was concerned. The man is completely sane, but inclined toward the bottle. Reese looked over at the bottle Jim had set beside Mrs. Wharton. His eyebrows went up eloquently. Jim said quickly, "If you choose to tell me of your correspondence with Mrs. Benning, the matter will go no further. It is strictly a matter of ethics." He took out his wallet and handed Reese his credentials before Reese could get around to asking for them. "You know where Mrs. Benning's nephew is?" Reese asked again. Jim said, yes, hoping he was right as to Jerry's whereabouts. He must have sounded sincere. Reese mopped his forehead with an immaculate handkerchief and leaned toward him. "You will, I trust, put me in touch with this Mr. Dupree as soon as possible?" Jim nodded. Reese didn't appear to be quite as stern. He said, Mrs. Benning wanted to discuss a coin she said she had found. She sent me a picture of it. I was shocked by what she sent. He eyed Jim cautiously. I don't know much about coins, Jim replied, leading him into the discussion with practiced skill. She sent me this photo. Reese took out a picture of a gold coin. Do you know what this is? He questioned in a voice rising with excitement. Without waiting for a reply, he said, It's an 1861 double eagle in uncirculated condition. So, what is the big deal over one measly coin? Jim asked with interest. Because Reese replied intensely, there are no known 1861 $20 gold pieces in this condition. Look at how perfect the date 1861 appears in the picture. Every coin in existence today shows a dropout in the bottom part of the date, especially in the 8 and the 6. There were 3 sets of dies sent in December 1860 to the New Orleans Mint. The $20 gold pieces produced in January 1861 by the United States government must have been perfect, like this coin. Those in existence today must have been made after the state of Louisiana took over the mint in February 1861. He paused to let this sink into Jim's skull. This coin is worth a minimum of $10,000, and probably a whole lot more. So you came all the way down here to buy this coin? Jim asked quickly. I came for 3 reasons, Reese replied. First, to see if this coin was real and not a counterfeit. Second, to discuss the purchase of the coin. And third, to talk to Mrs. Benning about where she found the coin. Why? Jim asked bluntly. Did she have more than one? Reese stopped and looked at him sternly, then managed to completely evade the question. Jim had learned all he wanted to know from Reese. Also, he had to play fair with him. He said, I will take you to Mrs. Benning's nephew as soon as this hurricane lets up. He is close and available. Why don't you go into the bar and have a drink? We will simply have to wait out the storm. Reese rose, nodded in Jim's direction, and went toward George's department. Jim walked across the lobby and sat down on the step next to Mrs. Wharton. She was the neat type. She had an ashtray beside her on the 3rd step and a drink in her hand. He poured one and stretched out his legs. Aunt Annie and Lena showed no interest in the booze, which proved how completely undone they were. The wind seemed to be getting under everybody's hide but Ladon. Lucky guy. Jim leaned over and put his mouth next to Mrs. Wharton's ear. Let's talk about why you are really here. She flashed a wary look, and then she realized he knew she had come to the Grand Manor for a reason. I don't make much money as a librarian, Mr. Smith, she said softly. When you stopped by earlier today, and you said you were writing about Mississippi history, and you asked about legends, I thought to myself, just maybe I could help you, and maybe make some money on the side. Of course, I didn't want to do it on company time. She looked through him. There are several legends in Hancock County, which could be useful to you. But this might take all night to explain. So what? They had all night if the hotel didn't crash down about their ears or get inundated. Jim trusted Aunt Annie where the last was concerned. He had to. Mrs. Wharton smelled good, she was very pretty, and she knew a lot of things which might prove useful. He glanced over at Aunt Annie and Lena. They looked shrunken and spiritless. He hated to see them like this, so he came up with an idea. Turning to Mrs. Wharton, he asked, What's your given name? Toots? No, Janet, she replied without missing a beat. She raised her eyebrows. Surely yours isn't really Charlie Smith? There is no such name. He grinned at her. As far as I know, you are half right. Really, it's Jim, but the last name is Smith. He rose. Those 2 old gals insisted on calling me Charlie, so I went along with them. They need therapy. He looked down at her. We got a long wait. After I dream up something to bring them back to life, we'll have a talk, huh? What else is there to do? He had a few good ideas, but they seemed impractical at the time. I need a good old-fashioned history lesson, and I'm not kidding. He crossed into the dining room, picked up a small serving table, and set it between the 2 old ladies. Aunt Annie, why don't you and Lena try a couple of hands of double solitaire? Where are the cards? There must be some someplace. Aunt Annie looked at him, and her backbone stiffened. Solitaire, she shouted. Her tone was scandalized. Of course I know where the cards are. Then she added gently, Charlie, you bring us both a Camille. Lena and I can play a snappy game of gin at 2 bits a game. He started for the bar, relieved. Aunt Annie went over to a shelf at the end of the room and picked up a pack of dog-eared cards from the second shelf. Jim had to make the Camille's. George was in no mood. Reese was smoking a cigar over a tall glass. When Jim went back into the lobby with the drinks, Lena was protesting. He moved the lantern so they could see the cards more easily. For bits of game, Lena was insisting. He looked around the room. The man in the shorts had somehow managed to fall asleep in his chair and was making small snoring noises. Mr. and Mrs. Tribble were making an attempt to sleep in the dining room. LaDawn had apparently retired to the little room back of the desk. About this time, the groom came up with a notion. He seemed quite firm about it. His bride looked helplessly receptive. He picked up a candle, put his arm around his bride, and announced loudly, which was unnecessary because Jim was the only one listening, "I think we will retire." They marched self-consciously past the desk and disappeared into the long side of the hotel. Now there was a guy with a great idea. Jim hurried back to Janet Warden and settled a little closer to her than he had before. She noticed. Hurricanes demand companionship. So how about the history lesson and the legends of Hancock County? Jim suggested. Something came down with a great clumping noise just outside the front door. He was glad it was dark outside. It was just as well they couldn't see the havoc. The noise didn't disturb Janet. She just looked at him with a question in her eyes. He obliged her. When this wasn't Mississippi, what was it and when? He asked. She took another swallow of whiskey, smiled at him from under those terrific eyelashes, and asked, "Which legend do you want to hear, the one about Napoleon's gold or the one about buried treasure?" She smiled a provocative smile as he decided. Napoleon's gold might be interesting, he offered, but personally I would prefer to hear about buried treasure. She lit a cigarette. The southeastern states, way back when, were known as the independent nation of West Florida. The Spanish, the French, the English, and just plain Americans all had a hand in settling the independent nation of West Florida. She seemed quite earnest. "Where does the buried treasure come in?" he interrupted. "Wait." In 1822, Mississippi was finally under the jurisdiction of the United States government. The land was given, over prior claims, to the settlers who lived on it and worked it. She paused for effect, then continued. Many of the early settlers were Americans who settled up and down the Pearl River, just to the west of here. She sipped her whiskey like it was lemonade and mused. The early settlers were hardy characters because this whole area was packed with privateers, thieves, and killers. The only accessible path was the old Spanish Trail, part of which is Highway 90 now. All the rest was wilderness. Believe me, the whole Gulf of Mexico was a pirate's dream. Right now, it didn't look like things had changed much. Whatever it had been, the Grand Manor was scarcely a deluxe spot on the Riviera. It seemed to still be a hideout for thieves and killers. It wasn't hard to imagine the way it must have been early in the last century. At the beginning of the Civil War, there was a family of Choctaw Indians living on one of the bayous west of here and north of Highway 90. One rainy night in the middle of March, a wagon came from the old Spanish Trail. The wagon was driven by a uniformed Confederate officer. 2 black slaves were in the back. She looked to see if Jim was paying attention. He was. The Confederate officer stopped the wagon, had the 2 slaves dig a deep hole, and once it was dug, he had them unload the wagon into the hole. They worked quite a while unloading before they realized they were never going to get out alive. One of them tried to hit the Confederate officer with a shovel, but he was shot in mid-swing. Then the officer shot the other black man too. Mrs. Warden stopped. "And how do you know this actually happened?" Jim asked in anticipation. "I know because there was a Choctaw Indian boy hiding in the woods when it happened. In 1954, when he was 99 and blind, he told this story to a newspaper reporter who wanted to know what he attributed his old age to. Apparently, the old man was barely 6 years old when the incident took place, but he remembered it like yesterday." Janet glanced at Jim to make sure he was listening. "So, why didn't he dig up what was buried?" Jim asked quietly. "Because the Indians felt it was an evil spot and the spirits were bad in that particular area. The Indians wouldn't go any place near there because of the 2 murders." "So, what was buried by the Confederate officer?" Jim questioned. "Well, that's the hard part. No one really knows. In those years when something was buried, the person who buried it always left a marker near the top of the site to identify what was below." Janet was talking a bit louder. "This was a mistake because it brought the Tribbles to life." Jim got a disapproving glance from Aunt Annie. Lena yelled, "Gin." Mr. Tribble helped his wife to her feet and up the steps from the dining room as they approached. At least Jim looked like he was running the ship. "Sorry to bother you, young man," said Mr. Tribble kindly. "We were not given a room. It seems ridiculous to sit out this storm. We either blow away or we don't." He turned to his wife. "Isn't that right, lover?" She nodded agreement. "Yes, lover." He smiled and asked, "Can you give us a room?" Jim pushed himself to his feet and went behind the desk and looked in the cubbyholes holding keys. "How about 110? He asked, sounding quite professional. He looked for the registration book in vain. LaDawn must have taken it to bed with him. Jim wished he had thought of it sooner. He handed Mr. Tribble a key. Tribble went to pick up 2 bags in the corner of the room, and Mrs. Tribble followed with a candle into the corridor, looking for 110. Jim did catch Mr. Tribble throwing an admiring glance in the direction of his history teacher. So Jim returned to class. "You've either got it or you have it." Janet had it. It wasn't just those legs. She looked healthy, and there was more. She had a certain spark one gal in 1,000 showed. Jim had to get back in her good graces and keep his mind on her story. "What do you think about the story?" he asked, trying to get her going again. "Do you think it's true?" "I've researched the subject intensely," she replied. She raised her eyebrows slightly and then captured his full attention. In 1861, the Civil War started. The only link to New Orleans, except by water, was along the old Spanish Trail. The wagon came from New Orleans. I studied the microfilm files from the Times-Picayune, and apparently the New Orleans Mint was in a state of confusion because the state of Louisiana was about to take over, and the Confederate government also wanted the mint. The New Orleans Mint history records indicate there was the possibility the mint was robbed because there were 3 funds which were supposed to be turned over to the Louisiana government, and at the same time the United States government wanted the mint funds returned to them. The superintendent of the mint refused to turn over the funds to the United States government or the Louisiana government. Janet glanced up to see if he was still paying attention. She continued, "The superintendent of the mint managed to stall both the United States government and the Louisiana government, and with the mint and the entire city in a state of chaos, the 5,000 $20 gold pieces and 330,000 silver half-dollars minted in January 1861 by the United States government were never turned over. Mint records showed all of the gold, and lots of the silver was traded for British gold sovereigns and then deposited into Citizens Bank in New Orleans. On March 15, 1861, those 5,000 double eagles minted by the U.S. government and some 330,000 silver half-dollars were turned over to the Confederate States of America by the Citizens Bank." Janet looked at him for relief. So the mint wasn't really robbed, but all the newly minted gold was exchanged legally for British gold sovereigns? He asked, watching her move a strand of hair from her face. "And what did the Confederate States of America do with the gold?" He smiled the question at her. "My story is real, Mr. Smith. Believe it or not, I think the money taken from the New Orleans Mint in 1861 was buried just outside Bay St. Louis, and I think the Confederate officer who buried the gold was an employee of the Mint." Janet took another long pull on her drink, and then she added, "I also think he had a friend named Jean Dupree." Jim might have arrived at the ancestors of Jerry Dupree with one question, but he was sure of one thing. Jean Dupree had apparently inherited her land, so perhaps Janet was right on target and didn't even realize it. Chances were too Janet was going to take her own sweet time in telling the rest of the story. So far she had proved coincidence can exist. Suddenly Janet's voice trailed off, and then she looked into his eyes and said bluntly, "Smith, if you're an author, I'm the Statue of Liberty." Her eyes had little lights snapping in them. "In the library I asked you about a book that has never been written by an author who never was. Before we go on with your history lesson, why don't you try answering my question? Who the hell are you?" Caught off guard, he thought it wise to keep his thoughts about her glib recital to himself. She was reeling it off far too well, and he needed more of the history lesson, but the only way he could keep it coming his way was to give her a good, believable answer. The truth. "My name is really Jim Smith," he said. "I come from Chicago." "You are correct. I'm not an author. As I told Mr. Reese a while ago, I work for a firm of private investigators. Besides walking into one large hurricane, I tramped into a big fat mystery in the Grand Manor, while looking for the heir to said hotel." He gave her his most earnest look. "You Would never believe how I got from Chicago to Bay St. Louis, unless I went into every sordid little detail. I will at length later if you insist. All this is beside the point. Whatever goes on here is probably related to something you know, especially since you have researched the buried treasure legend. I could probably find out a lot more if I had time to ramble through a couple of dozen books, but I don't have the time, and I do have you. Janet gave a questioning look, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with the truth. Then she said, I understand Mrs. Benning, who owned the hotel, is dead. Jim moved his head in agreement. She just plain died of old age? Janet asked. He shook his head. I would say she did not, but that's only supposition. You'll have to take my word for it. That's another reason I am trying to find out what has been going on here. Mrs. Benning was one of my customers recently, Janet added factually. She stopped by last week and asked if I had any books on United States coins. She checked out an edition of Coin Collector's Guide, but she never returned it. I was hoping to get it back from her before I heard she had died. Jim interrupted. Your name is really Wharton? She nodded. My father was Sam Wharton. He came here from Boston in the early 1950s. Then she smiled. He probably robbed a bank in Boston before he left. He was a crusty character with a will of his own. I can believe that, Jim announced, looking at her firm chin. Janet started to speak again, when suddenly Lena and Aunt Annie were at their side. Aunt Annie had fully recovered her faculties. She put her hand on his shoulder before he could get up. Now, Charlie, she said, there is no use in getting hysterical. In a few hours the hurricane will go north. Lena nodded her head. Yes, in a few hours the hurricane will go north. Just like a parrot, except she emphasized the word north, as if she disliked the thought of anything going in that direction. But a parrot would hardly reach for the bottle and drink without batting an eye. This she did, and passed the bottle to Aunt Annie, who, it seemed, could drink straight whiskey as well as Camille's. Aunt Annie had recovered her faculties. Lena looked coyly at Janet and then at Jim. My hurricanes make strange friends. What on earth have you two been talking about? He didn't have to answer because the front door blew in just as she finished the last word of her question. The wrought tan furniture took off into the dining room, and the table and cards followed. Jim yelled, Get into the bar, all of you, and grabbed the lantern before it took flight with the furniture. The lobby was empty before the words were out of his mouth. Hurricanes not only make strange friends, but they put wings on feet. All very well for everyone except him. Much as he disliked the man, he had to deal with Mr. Ladon. Dodging a chaise lounge, he ducked behind a desk, which seemed firmly anchored to the floor. Keeping the lantern reasonably upright, he looked into the little room back of the desk, expecting to have to carry Ladon out. Ladon was nowhere in sight, probably out the back door at the back of his room. Jim didn't blame him. The room looked like a cell. A sagging cot and a chair were the only furniture that he gave up on Ladon for two reasons. He couldn't chase the man down, and he didn't have suicidal traits. Jim raced across the lobby toward the bar, and somebody's hunk of tin roofing sailed through the front door of the hotel just behind him. If he had been a second later, half of him would be gone one way and half the other. Bertha won his total respect at that particular moment. She'd been close before. The Tribbles and the bride and groom probably were safer in their bedrooms, separated from the bar by one hurricane. The Tribbles had each other. The bride and groom had each other. Jim had the whole goofy crew, except for the elusive Beau Mitchell, Jerry Dupree, and Ladon. At the moment, he could get along very well without them. East of the bar was what used to be called a sun porch. It had windows on the south, but the east wall was solid, which formed protection for the bar. The bar, he hoped, wouldn't get the pilings and branches, or a boat that might have been left on the beach. There was a door between the sun porch and the lobby. He yelled at his crew, and it took all of them to close it. Then everybody trooped silently into the bar. He followed and looked them over. He had a captive audience. They were all standing there acting like he was going to lead them in Onward Christian Soldiers or Nearer, My God, to Thee just before the ship was sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Even George didn't look too tough. He was blowing and going from pushing shut the door. Instead of bursting into song, Jim waved at the table laden with bread, beans, and cheese. eat, drink, and he started to say and changed his mind. It didn't seem tactful. Drinks are on the house, he announced pleasantly. We have some waiting to do. At the moment, I would say we are relatively safe. He wasn't so sure about that, but it sounded good. His crew relaxed. Apparently, they trusted him. Aunt Annie sighed. Lena echoed her sigh. You could hear them both over the wind. The drunk on the bench had raised his head when they came in. Now he flopped back and went to sleep, happily unaware of Bertha's rising anger. Jim envied him, but somehow he was comparing bucking a hurricane with getting used to driving a nitroglycerin truck. You could get used to a hurricane the same way. Anyway, he did have something on his mind beside Bertha. He had been listening avidly to all the fancy history of the Gulf Coast and admiring Janet Warden's eyelashes. She had said, but, about the time Aunt Annie and Lena moved in on them and the whole lobby took off. He wanted to know where she was going from there, but that wasn't all. Her recital was very well done, too well done for him. He found Janet Warden sitting in a corner by herself, just the way he wanted her. He set the lantern on the bar, walked over to Janet, leaned over, and whispered in her ear, "Think up a good answer, sis, in about 20 seconds. That's all I get us a drink. You had it all down pat." "Why?" She gave him a half-scared look, and he relented. "I just want the rest of it, okay?" Everybody in the room seemed to have finally resigned themselves to waiting out the storm. Aunt Annie curled up on the bench across from the long, tall drunk. Lena sat next to her, staring into space. Jim carried 2 glasses over to the corner where Janet sat. For some reason, she seemed amused. She gave him a wide-eyed, innocent look, and then had the grace to look away. "Now," he said, plunking himself down beside her. "Give me the poop, lady. I know there must be something you haven't told me yet. I can feel it in my private investigator bones. Let's stop playing games. Maybe the waves were lapping at your feet. Maybe they weren't. But how come you arrived at the hotel?" The civil defense guys said they were moving the diehards to the schoolhouse. "And don't tell me you were just coming after your library book." She opened her mouth to speak, but he stopped her with his hand over her mouth. "Before you fill me in, I want you to know your speech sounded like it had been recently recited. It sounded like it came out of the local history book or newspaper. Could it be possible somebody else provided your story?" She stared at him. "How did you know?" Then she said, "All this didn't come out of a history book. A lot of it came from my father. He was my source for legends." "What about the waves lapping at your feet?" "They were lapping at my feet, really." The men with civil defense were quite annoyed. They suggested I look for shelter elsewhere. So I did. But I came here because I am naturally curious. You gave me that author routine. I could hardly swallow that. She looked around the room. Also, this is supposed to be the highest spot for miles. Everyone knows this place survived hurricanes before. She sounded dubious about the present. She hadn't answered entirely, but he knew she would get to the point eventually. "Did you know Mrs. Benning personally, other than just as a library visitor?" She shook her head. "Before I spoke of him. Did you ever hear of Jerry Dupree?" Again, she shook her head, but a light flickered in her eyes. "I guess I should have said Jerome Dupree, because I assumed that is his name. Of course, he is the rightful heir to this charming establishment, or what's left of it. You started to tell me something when Bertha took over the lobby. There must be more to your story. Something is missing." He looked at her intensely. She had been holding out on him. She replied quickly, "My father was a newspaperman. He worked as a stringer for the Times-Picayune. It was my father who did all the original research about the New Orleans Mint. It was also my father who spent literally years putting the story together. And it was my father who had his story entitled How the Mint Was Robbed published in the newspaper." Janet paused, and then dropping her eyes toward the floor, she added, "He was also the reporter who interviewed the old Choctaw Indian who had witnessed 2 killings in 1861. My father knew both stories were linked. He knew the mint was robbed, and he also knew where the money was buried. He only published the first story. The other he kept for me. At last they were getting somewhere. But instead of introducing the graveyard, Jim explained, in the Hancock County Courthouse I discovered the last grantee to a piece of land to the west of here was Mrs. Benning. To put everything into perspective, I also found out the piece of land she inherited was originally granted to Jean Dupree, an employee of the mint, buried the gold and silver coins on Mrs. Benning's property. An understanding smile spread across Janet's attractive face. Apparently, she was well aware of where Mrs. Benning's property was located. There was a long moment while they listened to a great thumping on the roof. Then she said conversationally, "You are thinking along the same track as I am. Maybe Mrs. Benning found the site where the mint money was buried, and someone killed her trying to find out." "What did Mrs. Benning look like?" he asked, knowing Janet had seen her recently, and she obviously kept a detailed photographic image of everyone. "She was short, and she didn't need to dye her hair. It was coal black," she commented. "Did Edith Benning have any Choctaw blood in her?" Jim asked. "Sure she did, but if you must know Mr. Jim Charlie Smith, I happen to have Indian blood in me too. So what's the matter with that?" "Look," he responded hastily, "there's nothing the matter with that. For all I know, I'm an 8th Cherokee. Who cares? But my stomach says eat. I'm going to gather up some food. You gun up on the Choctaws, Janet, while I forage for food." By this time, George had abandoned his bartending. He and the short salesman and the man in the shorts were slumped in chairs around a table. Lena had stretched out and joined Aunt Annie in slumber. Mr. Reese sat patiently at another table alone with his hands folded. He had no expression on his face and no glass in front of him. He did not crave the company of anyone. Jim walked around the bar and picked off 4 packs of potato chips, grabbed a plate of cheese from the table, and took his goodies to where Janet Warden was sitting cross-legged. It occurred to him the wind was losing strength, or maybe he was just getting used to it. He walked to the door to the lobby and looked through the small window at the top. The wind spun the spokes of the ceiling fan round and round over nothing. Even the well-anchored desk was gone. As he looked, a piling came through the front door. It slammed against something which must have been the rear wall of the dining room. If the back of the hotel was still around, it was a barricade of desks and chairs. He hoped it was. He returned to Janet Warden, who had pulled open a sack of potato chips and was making a meal of them. She pointed to her glass. "Can I have a little water for a change, Jim?" she asked softly. He found a pitcher back of the bar. Janet licked her fingers. She had stopped looking haughty. Instead, she verged on sarcasm. "You do know Indians inhabited this land before the white man came here. I mean the whole United States. Indians? What did he know about Indians?" His association with them was connected with a picture of Custer's last stand at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in a history book. He grinned at her. "Yes, you might say I do know that much." Apparently, she needed the water. The Indians did not refer to themselves as Indians. She was giving the first-grade treatment. They were the Shawnee, the Navajo, and so on. In the West Florida states, there were a number of tribes, but in what is now known as Mississippi and Alabama, there were a great number of the Choctaw tribe. She pointed a finger at me. And of all of them, the Choctaws were probably the most superstitious. For your information, most of the descendants of the people who settled in this area have a smidgen of Choctaw blood in them. She helped herself to a piece of cheese. "Maybe that's why I'm superstitious." She shrugged. "Oh, I don't go for the whole bit. Not enough Choctaw, I guess." "Superstitious? I suppose you won't walk under a ladder, and a black cat scares you to death," Jim suggested. "Pooh! Those fancy superstitions must have come over on the Mayflower. Have you ever heard of sheep jumping out of the ground, or sudden wild winds that spring from nowhere to protect Choctaw hallowed ground?" "No," he said without proper respect for her remarks on superstition. Then he yelled an "oh," so loud it should have brought everybody to their feet, if it hadn't been for the wind. He got his voice down. "And what did the Choctaws regard as hallowed ground?" "Burying grounds, cemeteries, for one," she said. "I know you won't believe it, but a bunch of us went into an Indian cemetery when I was in high school. This was up near Picayune. There was a sudden wild wind that sprang up from nowhere. It scared us half to death. We got out of there in a hurry, and we didn't go back." He looked to see if she smiled when she said it. She was in deadly earnest. Jim's mind went back to following Jerry Dupree to an abandoned graveyard on property belonging to his aunt. He had remarked to himself at the time Dupree took off from that spot almost in terror. For Jim, there was no wild wind, but for a Choctaw, the superstition might be so embedded imagination might have played tricks with his mind, as it had with Janet's. Jim supposed, under the circumstances, it must have taken more courage than he had ever thought to go out to a cemetery in the middle of the night. He looked at Janet. "Let's go back to a question that needs answering. Who recently got your curiosity up concerning the Dupree family, Janet? Come now, you didn't have it on the tip of your tongue. Not all of it. Some of it, yes, but the whole thing, no? Who has been gracing your library with questions about the Dupree land? She gave a mischievous smile. Which one do you want me to start with, Jim? She twirled a lock of her hair. Her eyes watched his face. He looked at her in exasperation. Oh, just start off wherever you want. I'll follow. She frowned. Lately, a tall, thin man who started skipping through the history books about like you did. And you, of course, immediately gave him the fascinating history of Mississippi and your legends? She ignored his sarcasm. No, he didn't ask about the mint being robbed. He seemed to know about that. She rested her chin in the palm of her hand. He was looking for a map. What did he look like besides being tall and thin? And how did he find out about the mint being robbed? And what map was he trying to find? Janet put her hands across her brows. Eyebrows from here to here, black-headed mean. She had pegged Bo Mitchell down to A.T. The mint robbery is alluded to in several books. But more than likely, he found a copy of the original article my father wrote. It was the best account and the most realistic. The story is not really a secret, but where the money might be buried is something else. He told me a woman in the courthouse referred him to me for an early map of this area. Did you have a map like that in the library? Jim's voice rose in excitement. Yes, she replied, then shook her head, anticipating the next question. No, he didn't take it. It was on the east wall in the corner of the library, just tacked on the wall, unframed. It had been there for years, based on the looks of it. After the man scanned a couple of books, he went over and looked at the map. He stood looking at it for a long time. Then he jingled some change in his pocket, smiled, and said, Well, Jerome. He acted as if I weren't there at all. Then he stalked out without another word. You said the map was there. He didn't take it, but it isn't there now. Explain. Jim watched her squirm. Day before yesterday, the map disappeared. I went across the street for a cup of coffee. We don't have much happening anyway in the library. I wasn't being negligent. There's hardly anything worth stealing in the place. I was gone about 10 minutes. When I returned, the map was gone. I didn't notice it until lunchtime. Oh, okay. So you had another visitor before the map disappeared. Who was it? Stop playing games. He waited for her explanation. Janet twirled the glass in her hands. Then she leaned over and whispered in his ear. Just before I went out for coffee, a woman came into the library. She browsed through Mississippi history and asked me a bunch of questions. She's here in this room. She nodded toward his old gal friends. His eyes went with hers to Aunt Annie, curled up sleeping innocently on the bench. That's the one, she said. Aunt Annie, dear old Aunt Annie from Detroit, who appealed to him for protection. It was Aunt Annie who claimed him as her nephew with the able assistance of Lena. She took charge of getting him a room in the Grand Manor. She handed him all that chatter about the demise of Jerry Dupree's Aunt Edith. It was she who told him her room was bugged. It was Aunt Annie who managed to slip into his room to get the story on his activities. Maybe Jerry had warned her. Somebody had. He looked sorrowfully at Lena asleep beside her friend. He supposed Lena wanted to get Aunt Annie out of the hotel safely. She knew something was wrong. So, she announced he was the long-lost nephew and played right into Aunt Annie's hands. Except Aunt Annie didn't know he was running after Jerry Dupree. What was the old girl after? And what did the map have to do with it? It might tell him the one thing he wanted to know. He didn't automatically believe all the stories of buried treasure, but the possibilities were interesting. He turned toward Janet and asked, What can you tell me about the map? Was it very old? She nodded. Yes, it was hand-drawn in the late 1850s. It had always been on the library wall. It added perspective to the development of the Bay, St. Louis area. You could see where the city developed, and you could see all the way along the old Spanish Trail to New Orleans to the west and to Mobile to the east. It seemed to be well drawn. She blinked her lashes at him. The old Spanish Trail was now Highway 90. There was no bridge back in the 1850s, so probably Highway 90 had run north of Bay, St. Louis on land, perhaps where Highway 12 now flowed both ways. Jim wished he could see the map. He looked at Janet Wharton. Wind or no wind, I have to get to the other part of the hotel. I would like it if you came with me, but it's up to you. You can stay here and be relatively safe or come along with me. Jim finished his drink slowly but his mind covered a lot of ground while Janet looked at him questioningly. With all the pieces coming together, he was beginning to believe the legend of the stolen mint money could actually be true. But what had Edith Benning found beside the one coin? And who had bumped her off? Who had killed the fat bellboy? And why? How did Bo Mitchell fit into the equation? Maybe the letter he had intercepted was the key. Jim vividly remembered his enjoyment in reading the hastily scrolled letter from the late Mrs. Benning. What had it said? Something about finding the markets? How involved was Aunt Annie? And had she really stolen the map from the library wall? Maybe Janet was trying to lead him astray, but at least so far she had been honest and apparently very truthful. He remembered uneasily the expression appearances are deceiving. No, Janet was beyond questioning. The person he really needed to talk to was Mrs. Benning's only heir, Jerry Dupree, and by this time he might be long gone. Jim had to get to the other side of the hotel, and now was his chance. He put down his glass and gave Janet his full attention. I have changed my mind. I doubt if you will be safer here. Whether you like it or not, Janet, you're going with me to the other part of the hotel. Maybe you have to powder your nose. We can't go through the lobby, so we'll go through the south door of the bar and around the back of the hotel. We'll get wet, but we won't get as much wind there. Try looking anxious. He should tell her. The south door of the bar was hinged open, probably due to Aunt Annie's orders. Jim looked around the room. The wind had taken over, whining and growling and throwing branches past the door. His ears hurt with the pressure. He doubted this was 150 miles an hour. It had to be more. Aunt Annie was asleep. The rest of them had joined her or were simply apathetic. Janet rose unsteadily to her feet. He put an arm around her. She dropped her head against his shoulder, and they made their way toward the door. The air was thick and sticky, but an occasional gust swirled through the door, cooling things off a little. Aunt Annie was snoring. He could tell from the movement of her lips. He felt Lena's eyes on them. Janet felt them too, because she put her arm around him and snuggled closer. He gave Lena a realistic leer and dragged Janet over to her and whispered, Mrs. Wharton has to powder her nose. Lena just stared at him with a blank expression on her face. Her hat slid over her forehead. Maybe she slept with her eyes open. He felt the warmth of Janet as they made the door. What a way to go, he thought as he reached for George's flashlight. There were plenty of candles on the bar for the others. If the wind or a falling tree didn't get them, Bo or the bristly one might. He couldn't figure their association, but Bo Mitchell was mean enough by nature to tackle anything. Jim couldn't discount him, wherever he was, and he couldn't ignore Jerry Dupree. He could only hope he was too scared to venture out from under the bed, if he had come to yet. He said to Janet, the corner of the hotel is about 3 or 4 yards to the right as we go out the door. Then we'll be behind the hotel and partially out of the big wind. If I lose you, stand next to the building. There's an overhang there which will protect you a little. She nodded and they stepped out of the door and into the wind. He didn't lose her. She hung onto his arm for dear life. They stumbled over branches, made it to the corner of the hotel with the wind shoving them, and turned the corner, flattening their bodies against the back of the building. In the darkness, the random sounds of butane tanks exploding was eerie. A spot of fireworks cracked over there. Heads and Jim saw the shed with the door swung open. He decided on a detour and pointed at the shed yelling, "Let's go," which probably saved their necks. A live wire cut loose and dangled close to where they had been standing. They groped and fumbled their way through the rain and wind to the shed and ducked inside. Jim shut the door behind them and turned the flashlight on Janet. She was breathing heavily and wringing out her hair. Finally, she got her breath. "My, isn't this a cozy little nest?" she said, looking about the shed. "Are we going to set up housekeeping here?" Jim didn't answer. He was playing the flashlight about the dilapidated building. The dirt floor had not been restored to whatever its original condition might have been. It had been well dug up. The guy hadn't missed an inch. Footprints were all over the place. To the right, on rickety shelves, were stacks of paper toweling and bars of soap. On top of them was a long roll of what appeared to be linoleum, half wrapped in paper. This was squashed down on the toweling. The shovel his foreign friend had been so industrious with was pitched into the middle of the dirt floor. It did not indicate his digging had been fruitful. Jim sloshed over to the wall and pulled at the paper on the long roll. Something was bugging him, but it wasn't coming through. He called to Janet, who was standing beside the door. "Let's try the inside room." He turned the light on the inside door at the back of the shed. There was a step up to this room at the end of the shed. Above was wooden flooring and pieces of carpeting spread around in a pitiful attempt to make the room more appealing. There were a couple of kitchen chairs and a scarred table holding old magazines. A few girly pictures had been tacked up on the walls. Along the east wall was a rack, and on it hung a few white coats. From the looks of them, this had been the sanctuary of the late, lamented bellboy. For the first time, he felt a little sorry for the guy. A cot, an old dresser, made up the rest of the furnishings. The mattress on the cot had been turned over, and the dresser drawers hung half open. The mess in the room, said the guy with the shovel, hadn't missed this room while he rooted around the shed. On the west wall of the room, all sorts of tools hung on pegs. There were wire cutters, hedge clippers, and even a chainsaw. In the far corner was a row of shelves, and a board covering the bottom shelf had been torn loose by the wind which was pouring through a gaping hole in the shed. When Jim saw the contents of the bottom shelf, he caught his breath. Stacked there were 5 boxes, identical to the one he had seen in Mrs. Benning's room on her dresser, candy boxes. The top one had been pulled out, and the contents dumped on the floor. Candy boxes? Somebody was nuts about sweets, Janet said. "I wonder whose room this is." "Was my sweet," he corrected her. The guy came up dead. He leaned over and looked at the contents of the box. They were all silver-wrapped, but they were not candy. He could have told her, "You are now looking at a shipment of heroin wrapped to resemble candy." But he didn't. Now he knew where LaDawn had gotten juiced up. He wondered what Mrs. Benning thought when she discovered the heroin. She must have found a box in the bellboy's room and taken it to her own. There was a lot of heroin in those boxes. If Bo Mitchell traded in dope, and well he might, wouldn't he consider whoever had hooked it a double-crosser? What was it he had said under his breath in San Antonio, right before Jim saved his tail? An outside wrapping paper in a wastebasket gave him the answer. Nobody had ever told him the bellboy's name was Al Burrows, but it couldn't be anything else. And the return address was J.D., and a box number in San Antonio, Texas. Maybe Bo Mitchell had catoned onto the gold while chasing down the double-crosser. But here was the dope, except for the box in Mrs. Benning's bedroom. And where was Bo? Jim dumped the silver-wrapped junk into the box and put all the boxes under the cot and replaced the mattress. It was the best he could do. He couldn't just run around the hotel in a hurricane with boxes of candy under his arm. He gave the room one more look. There was nothing more to see but a long hunk of square drain pipe lying against the wall and a broken pitcher beside the dresser. He took Janet's arm. She was shivering. He said as lightly as he could, "I don't think this establishment is for us. Now pay attention. The square root of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. The hypotenuse is the shortest way to the other side of the hotel." He accomplished his motive. She grinned. "Is? You certainly are well versed in trigonometry." She smoothed her wet dress. "Shall we hypotenuse away, my friend?" Something was ringing bells in his head. But, standing in a mildewed shed didn't hand him the answer. He led Janet to the door, and they took off for the hotel. A quick look at the back of the building told him all the debris from the lobby must have wound up in the dining room or kitchen, plus a few odds and ends from the beach. The back of the hotel seemed solid. There were no rattan items between them and the door. He didn't have to guess this door was the one to the sleeping side of the hotel. He had been through it several times already. He thought about his first entry after the bash on the head. Then he thought about the 2 people who had been in the shed when he looked through the window earlier. He tried to remember the setting when he went back into the hotel through the front door after he had watched through the window and put up the cars. It didn't make much difference because he had been gone too long. Anybody could have made it back into the hotel while he buffeted his way to the front. It occurred to him perhaps it was Bo Mitchell who had stood in the shed beyond his sight. He would have to catch up with Mitchell to find out, and that he fully intended to do. Now he was sorry he had brought Janet Warden with him. But she did know about the map, and maybe she was better off under his wing. The back door of the hotel was open, swinging wildly in the wind. He pointed up the back stairs with the flashlight. Then he started ahead of her, holding the flashlight down on the steps. The staircase creaked with their weight. The whole building creaked and shuddered. Bertha's fury was relentless. He stopped Janet at the second floor and motioned to the entrance. He opened the door to an empty hall. They could hear nothing but the cursed wind and rain. He put out his hand and took Janet's firmly in his. It was hot in the hall, and Janet's hand was wet. It didn't matter. So was his. They went quickly to Aunt Annie's room, and he opened the door. Closing the door on the empty hall, he turned the flashlight on the bed. Where would a maiden lady hide anything as large as a map? He asked Janet. That is, if she followed the usual procedure? She smiled. Under the mattress, of course, my dear Watson. They moved toward the bed together, and he lifted the mattress. Bingo! There it was, a map 3 feet square, faded and so thin you could almost see through it. Janet lifted it out gently and put it on the dresser. But he had seen something else. Underneath, it was a portrait. There was no doubt it was of the late Mrs. Benning. He stared at the portrait, and Mrs. Benning stared right back at him coldly from black eyes. The ebony coils of her hair were wound around her head in a braid. Except for the mouth, which was completely uncompromising, and the difference in sex, she resembled Jerry Dupree, whom Jim hoped was still hidden under his bed. Dupree had been right, even in his drunken state. This woman was proud, formidable, and stern. She would die before she told anybody anything against her will. And she had. What are you doing in my room? Aunt Annie's voice came from the door. Instinctively, Jim put his hand on his gun and wheeled around. But she held nothing more dangerous in her hand than a candle, which was still sputtering from getting wet. It was hard to be firm with her. She looked wet, bedraggled, and very frail. Jim pointed to the dresser. What are you doing with that map? And I might add, what is this portrait doing under your mattress? My goodness, how did you ever find it? I mean the map. Aunt Annie was stalling. Janet hid a smile. She lit a cigarette from a candle. For a minute, Jim wondered where she got it. After all, they were both still dripping wet. But he didn't have to ask. There was a dry pack at the back of the dresser. Come now, Aunt Annie, he said sternly. You cut out the picture, and you took the map from the local library, didn't you? Why? Aunt Annie cocked her head. She didn't look much like a thief. She even had a twinkle in her eye. I borrowed the map, Charlie. I wanted to see where Mrs. Benning was going every day. You see, I checked the speedometer on the bellboy's car. She frowned. I didn't put the picture under the mattress. She finally found an answer to that one. I've been framed, she announced. So, you've been framed, and you wanted to see where Mrs. Benning went every day. Speedometer. Why didn't you go to the courthouse as well as the library? Jim watched her face. I did. She looked abashed. Then she said hurriedly, I couldn't take the map back to the library in the middle of a hurricane, could I? Sit right down in that chair. Jim ordered. She sank into it. Now, Charlie, I really was framed. She fell silent. Jim turned to the map. He could see immediately the route of the old Spanish Trail. It ran north of Bay St. Louis, as he had supposed, and it turned a little to the south and then went straight west to New Orleans. He knew it did not follow the present-day Highway 90, which went due west from the bridge. According to his calculations, Highway 90 was considerably south of the old Spanish Trail marked on the map. He found the bayou with the man-made canals he had paralleled when he chased Jerry through the rain. He was right. His best guess was the old Spanish Trail originally crossed the bayou on Jean Dupree's land. They could do it, he said aloud. Do what? Janet and Aunt Annie asked in unison. Never mind, I think it would be a good idea to round up Jerry Dupree. He looked at the portrait of Mrs. Benning. So you were framed, Aunt Annie? Jim shook his head. Janet put out her cigarette, and Aunt Annie came out of her chair slowly. They followed him into the hall obediently. Bertha was heading north, and so was Jim if he ever got out of this mess. He stopped in the hall and turned to Aunt Annie. How did you get to this side of the hotel? The way you did, around the back, she snapped. Aunt Annie was herself again. She answered his next question before he could ask it. They are all asleep, she announced, even George. Without a word, Jim led them into his room. He looked under the bed. Jerry Dupree was among those missing. I thought you were looking for Jerry Dupree? Janet offered. I still am. Jim rose. Ladies, shall we go? If Jerry went of his own free will or was forcibly removed, there was only one place to find him. Jim stalked down the dreary hall to the back stairs. They followed him up to Mrs. Benning's rooms. He opened the door softly. From Mrs. Benning's inner bedroom, a weak light showed. Jim switched off the flashlight, put one of Aunt Annie's hands in Janet's, and took the other. Walking quietly through the middle of the room, they reached the half-open door of Mrs. Benning's bedroom. The candlelight from Mrs. Benning's boudoir flickered on a gruesome scene. Lying on the bare mattress with each hand and foot tied to the four posters of the bed with heavy rope cutting into his flesh was Bo Mitchell, or what was left of Bo Mitchell. Jerry Dupree stood over Mitchell, holding a bloody knife in his hand. Sweat ran down his face. He was completely unaware of their presence. Bo Mitchell wasn't dead yet, but he was going to be very soon. He had been cut up good, crossways and up and down, and the bed was saturated with his blood. Even though he must have known his number was up, he was ferociously contemptuous of death. His eyes were focused on Jerry Dupree. He struggled to get words out. Blood came with him. "You double-crossed me on that candy shipment, Dupree." "How many others came here?" he whispered. He tried to laugh, but his mouth was a grimace of blood. Then the guy was dead. Looking through the open doorway at his ex-employer, Mitchell wasn't any more appealing dead than alive. But nobody should have cut up Bo Mitchell like that. It wasn't sane. Aunt Annie and Janet were rooted to the doorway, barely breathing, their eyes wide with horror. Jim let go of Janet's hand and slid silently into the room with his gun in hand and groped his way into the closet, never taking his eyes from Jerry's back. He could see Aunt Annie and Janet through the opening and Jerry through the crack between the hinges of the door. Jerry dropped the knife when he realized Mitchell was dead, and he stared at the blood on his palm. Then he turned and became aware of the women who were transfixed in the doorway. Jim didn't have time to concern himself with their feelings. He was dealing with insanity wherever it was. Both women took their eyes from Bo Mitchell and stared at Jerry Dupree. The wind was gone. There was only the rain from Bertha's outer bands. Jerry's voice was a scream. "I didn't do it. I didn't do it," he kept mouthing. "I had the shipment sent here." He pointed to the candy box on the dresser, but his eyes were on the door. "Someone took it." He looked dazed with shock. "I didn't kill him," he kept on burbling. Then suddenly he backed against the wall. "I didn't tell him. I didn't tell Mitchell." His voice had changed to stark terror. Janet's head started to turn. Then she went rigid. Aunt Annie leaned weakly against the sill, but her head was up and turned toward Jim. Her eyes were trying to tell him something, and her mouth worked in her white face. Then all hell broke loose. Behind the two women in the doorway was Lena, her hat awry, her eyes wild. But the pistol in her hand meant business. Beside her was the bristly watchdog. She spoke to him in French, but her tone was to that of a dog. She pushed the two women ahead of her into the room. The watchdog's hand held a knife, a twin to the one Jerry had dropped. Apparently, he had used them both on Bo Mitchell. Lena had her eyes on Jerry Dupree, the insane, crafty, opaque black eyes of a fanatic lunatic. Annie and Janet were out of sight. Sweat streamed down Jim's face. He could have shot Lena then, but he had to listen to her words to complete the puzzle. "You are a fool, Jerome Dupree." She spat at him. "But you are not a brave fool like Edith Benning." Her voice rose. "Tell me where the shipment is, or I'll have Emil cut you to pieces like he did your friend on the bed." Jerry groveled against the wall. "Don't kill me." "I don't know. I don't know." His voice matched her scream. "Tell me where it is," she commanded, ignoring his words. "I know Edith found it and hid it. She almost told me. But in the end, she wouldn't tell that one on the bed either. She said she would rather die first." "She did." Aunt Annie interrupted her. "Now there was a woman with true guts. I have known you for years, Lena. Put that gun down. You need to rest." Aunt Annie's voice was quavering. "What a way to run a bluff." Lena didn't turn her head. She said without emotion, "I tried to get you to leave. It's too late now. You are a fool too. You have never known me." Lena drew herself up. "I am a Corsican. I have used up my patience. You will all die. I killed the fat bellboy and the man on the bed. What is one more body?" Then she suggested, "Perhaps this will be best. If I shoot the two women, Dupree, you will know I intend to have the shipment now. I will have Emil slash you, as I had him slash Edith Benning's portrait of Napoleon. Then you will tell me." Jim knew she was completely insane as she looked suspiciously around the room. "Where is he, Annie?" Where is your nephew? Where is he? She had finally gotten around to missing him. Janet answered before Aunt Annie could. He's dead. A hot wire dangled from the power lines and back. She put her all into that speech, but it was a waste of time. Lena was too far gone. Lena and her cohort were standing inside the doorway. Dupree was whining. I don't know where it is. I don't know. It's someplace in the hotel. I'll help you find it. Lena turned her gun to the left. Now she was laughing hysterically. She couldn't be aiming for anyone but Janet. Jim was counting on her making a mistake. She did. She took a step forward, stumbled over one of Edith Benning's doorstops, and trying to regain her footing, she fell. He opened the door fast and saw her head hit the solid wood of the bed. The gun she held flew out of her hand to the left. Jim let her bristly friend have one round in the leg. Dropping the knife, he pitched forward and withered on the floor, screaming in agony. Jim dove on Lena's prostrate form, but it wasn't necessary. Janet had quickly picked up Lena's gun, and Lena was out cold. He put Lena's hands behind her, and Aunt Annie knelt over her and calmly roped her hands with the purple cord from her pince-nez glasses. Dupree didn't seem to clue in on all that had happened. His hysterical voice filled the room. I don't know where they hid the shipment. I thought my aunt had it in the cemetery. She said something about markers. All the bells in Jim's head went off at once. He had thought the letter from Mrs. Benning had said markets because her handwriting was so poor. It actually had said markers. The funny thing was, she was not even talking about the shipment of dope. He stood. Shut up, Dupree, he yelled. Maybe you don't know where the shipment is, but I do. Dupree's mouth stayed open as he stared at Jim. Janet and I found it in the shed when the storm tore away a piece of the wall. It looks like Mrs. Benning and the bellboy did a good job of hiding it from everyone. The hurricane was over outside and inside the Grand Manor. He noticed out one of the windows the numismatist, Mr. Reese, had jumped into his rental car and sped off. He must have found out about the bellboy's corpse in the freezer downstairs and decided it was time to depart, especially since all the hotel records had disappeared in the storm. Apparently other guests had the same idea, and the hotel emptied quickly. Jim pulled a clear out to lunch Lena to her feet. Let's get out of here. I need to parley with the law. You go first, Dupree. Janet spotted the little red coin book Edith Benning had checked out of the library several days before she died. She slipped it into her purse. Jerry Dupree walked with a shudder past the dead man, followed by a silent Aunt Annie. Jim pushed Lena ahead, along with her wounded companion, and he put one arm around Janet's waist and left the room without turning around. After the Bay St. Louis police finished their questioning and carted away Jerry Dupree, Lena, her friend, assorted bodies, and the remainder of the shipment of heroin, Jim was alone at last with Janet. Well, Toots, that was kind of wild but fun, don't you think? She held up a $20 gold piece for him to admire. This was in the coin book. This was the marker Edith Benning was referring to in her letter to the coin dealer. She was talking about 2 markers, and this was one of them. The other must have been at the grave site you visited. She paused and let him examine the stunning gold coin dated 1861. He noticed the entire date was full and clear, not like the coins Mr. Reese said were in existence today with a flaw at the bottom of the 8 and 6. This had apparently been minted in January 1861 and was one of the original 5,000 which were exchanged for British sovereigns before they disappeared. I'll bet the other marker is the gravestone that was twisted downward. It looked like someone sat on it, he suggested. Are you thinking what I am? Janet looked at him with a broadening smile on her sweet face. Edith Benning located the treasure, and she never told anyone, even though she tried to tell Dupree. He looked at Janet in astonishment. If that's true, then the rest of the treasure must be buried beneath the grave marker. Let's go. Janet ran for his car with Jim giving chase. 3 weeks later in Chicago, a black Chevrolet Camaro pulled up to a parking meter 1 block before Coin World's numismatic headquarters. A little old lady in a bright yellow dress stepped out and made her way up the street to the entrance. She was buzzed through the dimly lit door by someone on the inside. Hello. Can you help me? I have some coins that have been in my family for generations, and I would like to sell them if they have any value. She looked at the fat man with a beard who approached her. Maybe you can tell me what these coins are worth, she announced hesitantly, as she unceremoniously dumped a small, faded bag onto the counter for the owner to examine. I hope you won't cheat me, she admonished him softly with a wink. We are registered coin dealers, madam. We don't cheat anybody. After examining the coins, with one hand over his heart he offered, honestly, these coins are in beautiful condition, but they will be hard to sell. I'll give you $7,000 for the 1861, $20 gold pieces, and I'll give you $500 for each of the 1861, silver half dollars. That's the best I can do. With practiced patience, he watched her squirm. I have a coin book here, she replied with a firm set to her voice. The dealer easily noticed the red book she held in her hand was printed 4 years earlier. Also, he noticed it said, Property of the Bay, St. Louis Library, in bold black letters stamped on the inside front cover. And what does your coin book show? Asked the salesman. It indicates right here the gold coins I have are worth $10,000 each, and the silver half dollars are worth $1,000 each. Now what do you say to that? She glared at him. Okay, I'll give you $9,000 for each of the gold coins and $900 for the silver half dollars. The best thing is I will give you cash right now. You won't even have to register your social security number, pay taxes, or anything. The coin man had her now. Well, young man, I want you to know I will take the cash, but I always pay taxes, and I want to give you a social security number just for the records, so I won't get in any trouble later. With that, she gave him the social security number, signed a receipt, picked up the cash, and left. Walking quickly back to the Camaro, she eagerly entered the wide-open back door. How did it go, Aunt Annie? Janet Wharton and Jim Smith asked in unison. Well, I'm getting better at selling because this time I got a higher price. But I have a lot to learn, don't I? She laughed as she added the money to the almost full box in the back seat. Okay, gang, now we have 4 more coin dealers to see today, so let's get cracking. Aunt Annie smiled as she filled her little bag again, then added, once they discover Lena's social security number leads them to a Mississippi prison, they may want their money back. Thank you for listening to IFFI Audiobooks. We hope you enjoyed the story, and don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon.